June 7, 2021. Just after 10 p.m., a frantic 911 call came from a remote hunting property in South Carolina. The caller was Alex Murdaugh. His voice trembled as he told the dispatcher that something terrible had happened. His wife and son had been shot. When deputies arrived at the family's Moselle estate, they found a scene that was difficult to comprehend. Near the dog kennels lay 52-year-old Maggie Murdaugh. A short distance away was her 22-year-old son, Paul. Both were dead. Both had been killed in a brutal attack. And whoever was responsible was nowhere to be found. At first, there was no obvious suspect. No sign of a break-in. No eyewitnesses. No clear explanation for why two members of one of South Carolina's most prominent families had been murdered. Investigators considered every possibility. Was this revenge? Was Paul the target because of his involvement in a deadly boating accident that had drawn national attention? Or had someone else wanted to send a message to the powerful Murdaugh family? At the center of it all was Alex. A grieving husband. A grieving father. And, by all appearances, another victim of an unimaginable tragedy. But as investigators began reconstructing the family's final hours, the story started to change. Cell phone records were examined. Timelines were rebuilt. Witnesses were interviewed. And then detectives uncovered something they never knew existed. A short video, recorded just minutes before Maggie and Paul were killed. A piece of evidence that would transform the entire investigation. Because the deeper investigators looked, the more one question refused to go away. How did a man who reported the murders of his wife and son eventually become the prime suspect in their deaths? This is the story of the Murdaugh murders. And the truth behind the deaths of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. But before we get to the evidence, the investigation, and the questions that would eventually surround Alex Murdaugh, you first need to understand who the Murdaughs were. Because in South Carolina's Lowcountry region, the Murdaugh name wasn't just well known. It carried power. For nearly a century, members of the Murdaugh family had built a legal dynasty unlike anything most communities ever see. Generation after generation, they held influential positions within the local justice system, prosecuted criminal cases, and established a reputation that stretched across several counties. To many residents, the Murdaughs weren't simply another wealthy family. They were part of the area's identity. Their name opened doors. Their influence was impossible to ignore. And at the center of that legacy was Alex Murdaugh. Like the generations before him, Alex had built a career as an attorney. He came from a family that had spent decades earning respect, power, and connections throughout the region. By all appearances, he seemed to be continuing the family tradition. Standing beside him was his wife, Maggie. Friends and acquaintances often described Maggie as warm, devoted to her family, and deeply involved in the lives of those closest to her. While Alex's work often kept him in the public eye, Maggie largely remained outside of it, focusing on family and maintaining the life they had built together. The couple had two sons. Buster, the older brother, was seen as quiet and reserved. Paul, the younger son, was known for having a larger personality. He was outgoing, energetic, and often found himself at the center of attention. Like many families, they weren't perfect. But from the outside looking in, they appeared to have everything. A successful legal career. A respected family name. Financial security. Multiple properties. And a future that seemed firmly in place. To friends, neighbors, and many people throughout the community, the Murdaughs represented success. The kind of family that appeared untouchable. Which is exactly why the murders of Maggie and Paul sent shockwaves far beyond South Carolina. People weren't just asking who could have committed such a crime. They were asking how something like this could happen to a family like the Murdaughs. But while the public saw a powerful family whose future seemed secure, a very different reality was beginning to take shape behind closed doors. And long before the murders at Moselle, cracks had already started to appear. Beneath the image of success, serious problems were already beginning to emerge. For years, the Murdaugh family had enjoyed a level of influence that few families ever experience. But by 2019, that image was starting to crack. In February of that year, a boating trip involving several young people ended in tragedy. Among those on board was Paul Murdaugh. In the early hours of the morning, the boat crashed, throwing multiple passengers into the water. 19-year-old Mallory Beach never made it home. Her body was found days later. The incident quickly became one of the most talked about cases in South Carolina. As investigators examined what happened that night, questions began to surround Paul. Eventually, he was charged in connection with the crash. For perhaps the first time in decades, the Murdaugh family found themselves facing a level of public scrutiny they weren't accustomed to. News coverage intensified. Public opinion became increasingly divided. And as the criminal case moved forward, another problem was beginning to take shape behind the scenes. A civil lawsuit filed by Mallory Beach's family threatened to expose details of the Murdaugh family's finances. Lawyers began requesting records. Questions were being asked, and the legal pressures surrounding the family continued to grow. What had once seemed like an unfortunate accident was now creating consequences that extended far beyond the courtroom. The Murdaugh name was appearing in headlines for reasons no family with their reputation would ever want. And while the public focused on the boat crash, few people realized just how much pressure was building behind closed doors. By 2021, Alex Murdaugh was facing challenges from multiple directions. His family was under scrutiny. The lawsuits were continuing. The attention surrounding the boat crash wasn't going away. And according to prosecutors, financial problems were becoming increasingly difficult to hide. The image of power and success that had defined the Murdaugh family for generations was beginning to show signs of strain. From the outside, their lives still appeared intact. But beneath the surface, the pressure was mounting. And no one could have imagined how quickly everything was about to change. Then, in June 2021, everything would come crashing down. June 7, 2021, began like any other day. There was no indication that within a matter of hours, 2 members of the Murdaugh family would be dead. Throughout the day, Alex, Maggie, and Paul went about their normal routines. Nothing appeared out of place. No emergency calls. No reports of threats. No signs that the family was preparing for what was about to happen. As the evening approached, the family gathered at Moselle, the sprawling hunting property that had become a central part of their lives. The estate stretched across hundreds of acres of rural South Carolina land, offering privacy and isolation far from public view. For the Murdaugh family, it was familiar territory, a place where they spent time together away from the pressures of everyday life. That evening, Alex, Maggie, and Paul shared dinner together. It would be one of the last times they would ever be seen as a family. At that point, nothing seemed unusual. There were conversations, text messages, phone calls, the kinds of ordinary moments that happen every day and are quickly forgotten. But in hindsight, investigators would spend years examining those moments in extraordinary detail. Because somewhere within those final hours was the answer to what happened next. As the sun began to set over Moselle, activity around the property continued. Paul spent part of the evening tending to one of the family's dogs. Meanwhile, phones continued recording a digital trail of messages, calls, and movements. At the time, none of it seemed important. Later, it would become some of the most closely analyzed evidence in the entire case. Shortly after 8 p.m., the family was still together on the property. Cell phone data and witness accounts would later help investigators piece together where each person had been and what they were doing. It was a reconstruction built from tiny details. A text message here, a phone call there, a few steps recorded by a cell phone, fragments that would eventually tell a story. As the evening progressed, Alex, Maggie, and Paul made their way toward the dog kennels located a short distance from the main residence. The kennels sat in a more secluded area of the property. Surrounded by trees and open land, it was quiet. The kind of place where very little could be heard beyond the sounds of animals and the countryside. At approximately 8:44 p.m., Paul used his phone to record a brief video. The clip lasted only seconds. At the time, it appeared completely ordinary. There was no sign of danger, no indication that anything was wrong.
It's okay. Come here. Come here. Shit. Come here. Hey, he's got a bird in his mouth. Hey, Bubba.
It's a guinea.
This is a chicken.
Come here, Bubba.
Come here, Cash.
Come here, Bubba.
Cash. Quit.
Come here, Bubba.
Paul wasn't documenting evidence. He wasn't recording a final message. He was simply capturing a moment. But what that phone recorded would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Because investigators would eventually determine that Maggie, Paul, and Alex were all present near the kennels around that time. It was one of the last confirmed moments they were together. Minutes later, Maggie's phone showed activity. Messages were exchanged. Calls were missed. Then, gradually, the digital trail began to slow. Investigators would later examine every movement, every notification, every interaction recorded by the devices that night. Not because any one piece of evidence revealed the truth, but because together, they painted a picture of the family's final moments. As darkness settled over Moselle, the evening appeared to be coming to an end. For Maggie and Paul, there was no indication that danger was approaching. No evidence that they were preparing to leave. No sign of a struggle. Nothing to suggest that these ordinary moments would soon become the subject of a murder investigation watched by millions. The final messages were sent. The final conversations took place. The final movements were recorded. And then came the last known moments Maggie and Paul Murdaugh were alive. Just minutes later, everything went silent. For a period of time, nobody knows exactly what happened near the kennels at Moselle. There were no eyewitnesses. No surveillance cameras capturing the moment. No dramatic confrontation caught on video. Only a stretch of darkness across a rural property and a timeline investigators would spend years trying to piece together. Then, at approximately 10:07 p.m., that silence was broken. A 911 call came in from Moselle. The caller was Alex Murdaugh. His words were rushed. His voice was emotional. He told the dispatcher that he had returned to the property and found his wife and son lying near the dog kennels. They had been shot.
911, where's your emergency?
This is Alex Murdaugh at 4147 Moselle Road. I need the police to answer immediately. My wife and child just shot badly.
Okay, you said 4147 Moselle Road in Allison?
Sir?
You said 4147 Moselle Road in Allison?
Yes, sir. 4147 Moselle Road.
Stay on the line with me, okay? Yes, sir. Stay on the line with me, okay?
Conner County Communications.
Carlton, I have an Alex Murdaugh on the line, caller from 4147 Moselle Road. He's advising that his wife and child was shot.
Okay, and sir, give me the address again.
It's 4147 Moselle Road. I've been up to it now. It's bad.
Okay. Okay, and are they breathing?
No, ma'am.
Okay, and you said it's your wife and your son?
My wife and my son.
Are they in a vehicle?
No, ma'am. They're on the ground out at my kennels.
Okay, and did you see anyone? Okay, is he breathing at all?
No.
Is she? Okay, do you see anything? Do you see anyone in the area?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
What color is your house on the outside? What color is your house on the outside?
It's white. You can't see it from the road.
Okay, is it a house or a mobile home?
It's a house.
Okay, and what is your name?
My name is Alex Murdaugh.
Okay, and did you hear anything, or did you come home and find them?
No, man, I've been gone. I just came back.
Okay, and was anyone else supposed to be at your house?
No, ma'am. Please hurry.
We're getting somebody out there to you. Okay, what is her name?
Maggie and Paul.
Maggie is her name?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And please hurry.
We're getting somebody out there to you. Me asking you these questions don't slow them down, okay? And you sure they're not breathing? Is he moving at all, your son? I know you said that she was shot, but what about your son?
Nobody's. They're not. Neither one of them's moving.
What is your telephone number? And does anything look out of place?
Ma'am, not particularly, really, no, ma'am.
Okay.
Are they close, ma'am?
Yeah, they've been en route with you ever since you've got on the phone with me. I have multiple people coming out there to you. Okay. I don't want you to touch them at all, okay? I don't know if you've already touched them, but I don't want you to touch them just in case they can get any kind of evidence, okay?
I'd already touched them trying to get to see if they were breathing.
Okay. Well, I just don't want you to move anything just in case they can get any kind of evidence, okay?
As emergency responders made their way to the scene, they had little idea of what they were about to encounter. But when deputies arrived at the property, it quickly became clear that this was not a routine call. Near the kennels lay Maggie Murdaugh. She had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. A short distance away was Paul. He too had been shot. Neither survived. The crime scene was devastating. Two members of one of South Carolina's most prominent families had been killed on their own property. And at that moment, investigators had more questions than answers. Who would want Maggie and Paul dead? Had they been specifically targeted? Was this connected to Paul's involvement in the boating crash that had drawn national attention? Had someone come to Moselle seeking revenge? Or was there another explanation entirely? In the hours that followed, investigators began securing the property and documenting the scene. Every detail mattered. Every footprint. Every tire track. Every shell casing. Every item left behind. Somewhere within that evidence, they hoped to find a clue that would lead them to whoever was responsible. Meanwhile, news of the murders began spreading throughout South Carolina. The reaction was immediate. Many people were stunned. The Murdaugh family had spent generations building influence and respect throughout the region. Now, that same family was at the center of a homicide investigation. Friends, neighbors, and members of the community struggled to understand what had happened. For many, it seemed impossible. The murders felt less like a local crime and more like something out of a movie. The powerful family. A remote estate. Two victims. No obvious suspect. And a mystery that appeared to have no clear answers. In the days that followed, investigators worked to reconstruct the final hours of Maggie's and Paul's lives. They reviewed phone records. They examined the crime scene. They followed leads. And they considered every possible theory. At first, attention naturally focused outward. Perhaps someone had been holding a grudge. Perhaps the family had been targeted. Perhaps the answer lay somewhere beyond the gates of Moselle. But as detectives continued digging deeper into the evidence, they began uncovering details that didn't quite fit. Small details at first, the kind that might easily be overlooked. Yet together, those details would slowly begin to change the direction of the investigation. Because the more investigators learned about what happened that night, the more they realized that the answers they were looking for might not be as far away as they initially believed. In the days following the murders, investigators faced an enormous challenge. They had two victims, a large rural property, and no eyewitnesses who could tell them what had happened between the family's final moments together and the discovery of the bodies. Every possibility remained on the table. Detectives explored the idea that the killings could have been an act of revenge. Others wondered whether the attack might somehow be connected to the 2019 boating accident involving Paul Murdaugh. Given the attention that case had received, many believed it was a reasonable place to start. But investigators couldn't afford to focus on a single theory. Not this early. Every lead had to be examined. Every possibility had to be considered. As the investigation expanded, detectives began doing what investigators often do in major homicide cases. They started building a timeline, not of the murders themselves, but of the hours leading up to them. Who was where? Who spoke to whom? What happened before the 911 call? And perhaps most importantly, what could be independently verified? To answer those questions, investigators turned to one of the most valuable witnesses in modern criminal investigations. Technology, phones, messages, call logs, location data, vehicle records. Unlike human memory, digital evidence doesn't forget. It records. And as investigators began collecting and analyzing that information, they slowly started reconstructing the final hours of June 7th. At first, much of the evidence appeared routine. Calls between family members, text messages, normal activity, the kinds of interactions that occur every day without a second thought. But homicide investigations are rarely solved by one dramatic piece of evidence. More often, they're solved by dozens of small details that begin to form a larger picture. And that's exactly what investigators believed was happening. The more information they gathered, the clearer the timeline became. But at the same time, new questions were beginning to emerge. Questions about movements. Questions about timing. Questions about who had been where that evening. Individually, those questions didn't prove anything. But collectively, they demanded answers. As investigators continued reviewing evidence, they began comparing statements against the digital records they were collecting. The goal wasn't to prove guilt. The goal was simple. Determine what happened. Establish the facts. Follow the evidence wherever it led. And little by little, that evidence was beginning to lead them somewhere unexpected. What initially appeared to be a straightforward search for an outside suspect was becoming something much more complicated. Behind every phone call, every text message, and every minute accounted for on the timeline, investigators were uncovering details that challenged some of their early assumptions. The case was changing, and soon, detectives would discover a piece of evidence that would force them to look at the murders in an entirely different way. A piece of evidence hidden inside a cell phone. A recording so brief that it lasted only seconds. Yet those few seconds would eventually become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. Because what investigators were about to uncover would completely change the direction of the case. The evidence came from a place few people expected. Paul Murdaugh's cell phone. At some point during the investigation, detectives recovered a short video that Paul had recorded on the evening of June 7th. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about it. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a recording of a crime. In fact, the video had never been intended to document anything significant at all. Paul had reportedly been trying to capture footage related to one of the family's dogs. It was the kind of ordinary recording that most people make without giving it a second thought. But in a murder investigation, context can change everything. As investigators examined the footage more closely, they realized the importance of what had been captured wasn't what could be seen. It was what could be heard. Voices. Several voices. And according to testimony presented during the investigation and later at trial, those voices appeared to belong to Maggie, Paul, and Alex Murdaugh. For investigators, that discovery immediately stood out. Not because it identified a killer, but because it helped establish something critically important. Who was present near the kennels shortly before the murders?
Hey, he's got a bird in his mouth.
Hey, Bubba.
It's a guinea.
This is a chicken.
Come here, Bubba.
Come here.
Come here, Bubba.
Cat. Quit.
Until then, detectives had been relying on interviews, recollections, and statements to reconstruct the family's final movements. Now they had something different. A time-stamped recording. A digital snapshot of a moment in time. And according to investigators, That moment placed all three family members together near the kennels during the final minutes before Maggie and Paul stopped responding to calls and messages. On its own, that fact may not have seemed extraordinary. After all, this was a family gathered on their own property. Being together wasn't suspicious. But investigators weren't looking at the video in isolation. They were comparing it to everything else they had collected. Statements, timelines, phone records. And as those pieces began coming together, the significance of the recording became much harder to ignore. Because according to investigators, there was a problem. A serious one. In interviews conducted after the murders, Alex Murdaugh had maintained that he was not at the kennels with Maggie and Paul shortly before they were killed. Instead, he described a different sequence of events. But the video appeared to tell a different story. If investigators were correct about the voices captured in that recording, then Alex had been much closer to Maggie and Paul in their final moments than previously believed. Suddenly, what had once seemed like a settled part of the timeline was no longer settled at all. The video didn't prove who committed the murders. It didn't show the shootings. It didn't identify a weapon. But it raised a question investigators could no longer ignore. Why would someone provide an account of their movements that appeared to conflict with evidence recovered from the victim's own phone? That question would become one of the most significant issues in the entire case. And it wasn't the only problem investigators were uncovering. Because as detectives continued analyzing digital evidence, another picture was beginning to emerge. One built from phone activity, location data, vehicle movements, and a timeline that investigators believed told a very different story about what happened on the night of June 7th. The Kennel video had changed the investigation. Now, detectives wanted to know what the rest of the digital evidence would reveal. As investigators continued examining the family's phones, vehicles, and electronic records, they began doing something that would become central to the case. They started rebuilding the night of June 7th, minute by minute. Not through eyewitness testimony, not through speculation, but through the digital footprints left behind by the people involved. Every call, every text, every movement recorded by a device. Every piece of data became part of a much larger puzzle. What investigators were attempting to answer was a simple question. Could technology help explain what happened during the final moments of Maggie's and Paul's lives? As analysts reviewed the evidence, a clearer picture of the evening began to emerge. Cell phone records helped establish when phones were being used, when messages were being sent, when calls were being made, and perhaps just as importantly, when activity suddenly stopped. For investigators, those moments mattered, because they believed the digital timeline was helping narrow down the period in which the murders occurred. Maggie's phone became a particularly important piece of the investigation. Detectives closely examined its activity, looking for anything that might provide insight into her final movements. Messages, missed calls, changes in activity. Even the smallest details were scrutinized. Not because any single event provided a definitive answer, but because investigators believed each detail added another piece to the timeline. The same was true for Paul's phone. By comparing activity across multiple devices, detectives worked to determine who was communicating, when they were communicating, and what was happening around them. The process was slow, methodical, and often highly technical. But as more information was gathered, investigators believed they were beginning to see patterns emerge. Then there was the vehicle data. Modern vehicles can record valuable information about movements and activity, and investigators analyzed records connected to the vehicles involved in the case. Once again, the goal was the same: establish a timeline, verify movements, separate assumptions from facts. By this stage of the investigation, detectives were no longer looking at isolated pieces of evidence. They were comparing everything together: the Kennel video, the phone records, the vehicle data, witness statements. Every piece was being placed alongside the others. And according to investigators, some of those pieces didn't fit as neatly as they should have. Questions remained about movements that night. Questions about timing. Questions about who had been where and when. The deeper detectives looked, the more they found themselves returning to the same critical period of time. the final minutes before Maggie and Paul stopped responding to calls and messages. That window became one of the most intensely examined periods of the entire investigation, because investigators believed that if they could accurately reconstruct those minutes, they could better understand what happened at Moselle. And as they continued following the digital trail, another aspect of the case was beginning to attract their attention. A motive. Because while detectives were building a timeline of the murders, they were also uncovering information about events taking place far beyond the crime scene. Events that investigators believed could help explain why the murders happened in the first place. The question of who was responsible remained at the center of the investigation. But increasingly, detectives were also asking another question, and the answer they would eventually propose had nothing to do with strangers, revenge attacks, or unknown intruders. Instead, it led them into a world of financial secrets, mounting pressure, and allegations that threatened to bring down one of South Carolina's most powerful families. According to investigators, the search for a motive led them far beyond the crime scene at Moselle. As detectives dug deeper into Alex Murdaugh's personal and professional life, they began uncovering allegations that painted a very different picture from the one the public had seen for years. To many people, Alex was a successful attorney from one of the most influential families in South Carolina. He came from a legal dynasty. He was respected in the community. And from the outside, he appeared to have built a life that reflected the prestige associated with the Murdaugh name. But investigators would eventually discover that behind that image were allegations of serious financial misconduct. As financial records and business dealings came under scrutiny, questions began emerging about money that prosecutors later alleged had been misappropriated over a period of years. The accusations were significant, and if proven, they threatened not only Alex's career but also the reputation of a family whose name had carried influence for generations. According to prosecutors, the financial pressure facing Alex wasn't the result of a single problem. It was the result of multiple issues converging at the same time. The civil lawsuit stemming from the 2019 boat crash continued moving forward. Attorneys involved in the case were seeking financial information. The family's finances were facing increased scrutiny, and investigators would later learn that concerns about missing funds were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Then came a detail that prosecutors believed was particularly important. Evidence presented at trial suggested that on the same day Maggie and Paul were murdered, questions surrounding Alex's finances were intensifying. For prosecutors, the timing was impossible to overlook. Not because it directly connected Alex to the murders, but because it provided context. A glimpse into what they believed was happening behind the scenes as pressure mounted from multiple directions. By this stage, investigators believed they were no longer looking at isolated problems. They were looking at a man who, according to the state's theory, was facing a growing crisis. Professional pressure, financial pressure, legal pressure, public pressure. One problem alone may not have seemed overwhelming, but together, prosecutors argued, they created a situation that was becoming increasingly difficult to contain. It was this combination of circumstances that would eventually form the foundation of the state's motive theory. Prosecutors argued that the murders shifted attention away from the financial allegations that were threatening to expose years of misconduct. Almost overnight, the focus changed. Instead of questions about missing money and legal troubles, public attention turned toward the shocking murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. The defense strongly disagreed with that interpretation. They argued that the prosecution was attempting to connect unrelated issues and that motive alone could never prove guilt. It would become one of the central battles of the trial. But regardless of which side people believed, one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The investigation had changed dramatically since the night of June 7th. What began as a search for an unknown killer had evolved into a case centered around someone investigators once viewed as a victim. The evidence had been collected. The timelines had been reconstructed. The motive had been proposed. Now, the case was heading to the place where every piece of evidence would be tested. A courtroom. And before long, the world would be watching as Alex Murdaugh stood trial for the murders of his wife and son. By the time the case reached a courtroom, it had already become one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in the country. The murders themselves had captured national attention. But so had the allegations surrounding Alex's finances, the prominence of the Murdaugh family, and the growing list of questions that seemed to follow the case at every turn. For weeks, prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared to present two very different versions of what happened on the night of June 7, 2021. At the heart of the trial was a question that had divided public opinion from the very beginning. Did the evidence prove that Alex Murdaugh murdered his wife and son? Or had investigators focused on the wrong person? The prosecution argued that the answer could be found in the evidence. They walked jurors through the timeline investigators had spent months reconstructing. The family's movements, the phone records, the vehicle data, and most importantly, the Kennel video recorded on Paul's cell phone. According to prosecutors, that video placed Alex near Maggie and Paul just minutes before they were killed. It was a critical piece of evidence, not because it showed the murders, but because it directly challenged earlier statements about where Alex had been that evening. Prosecutors argued that when the digital evidence was viewed as a whole, it painted a clear picture. A picture they believed pointed directly to Alex Murdaugh. The defense saw things very differently. They argued that the state's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. There was no murder weapon presented in court, no eyewitness who saw the shootings, no surveillance footage capturing the crime itself. According to the defense, prosecutors were asking jurors to make a leap from suspicion to certainty, and they insisted that those were not the same thing. As the trial unfolded, jurors heard testimony from investigators, forensic experts, digital analysts, and numerous other witnesses involved in the case. Each side attempted to strengthen its own narrative while challenging the conclusions of the other. But one of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when Alex Murdaugh made a decision that many criminal defendants never make. He took the witness stand. 4 days, the jury listened as Alex answered questions about his family, his finances, his actions on the night of the murders, and the many allegations that had surfaced during the investigation. The testimony drew enormous public attention, and during that testimony came one of the most significant admissions in the entire trial. Alex acknowledged that he had not been truthful about being near the kennels before the murders. For prosecutors, it was a powerful moment. They argued that an innocent person would have had no reason to lie about such an important detail. The defense countered that while Alex had lied about certain things, dishonesty did not automatically make him a murderer. The debate became one of the defining issues of the case. As closing arguments approached, both sides knew the stakes could not have been higher. The prosecution told jurors that the evidence, when viewed together, led to one conclusion. The defense argued that too many questions remained unanswered, and that reasonable doubt still existed. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and argument, the case was finally in the hands of the jury. The world waited. The Murdaugh family waited. And Alex Murdaugh waited. The decision that followed would become one of the most talked about verdicts in modern true crime history. After weeks of testimony and hours of deliberation, the jury reached its decision. The courtroom filled with anticipation. For everyone involved, years of questions, investigations, and legal battles had led to this moment. Maggie and Paul Murdaugh were gone. The evidence had been presented. The arguments had been made. Now it was time for the jury to speak. On March 2, 2023, Alex Murdaugh stood before the court as the verdicts were read. Guilty of the murder of Maggie Murdaugh. Guilty of the murder of Paul Murdaugh. The decision came relatively quickly considering the complexity and scale of the case. For prosecutors, the verdict represented the culmination of an investigation that had transformed from a search for an unknown killer into a case against a man they believed had been responsible from the beginning. For the defense, it was a devastating outcome. They had argued throughout the trial that the evidence was circumstantial and that prosecutors had failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury disagreed. In the eyes of the court, Alex Murdaugh was responsible for the deaths of his wife and son. The following day, he returned to the courtroom for sentencing. Before imposing the sentence, the judge reflected on the extraordinary nature of the case and the tragedy that had brought everyone there. Then came the punishment. 2 life sentences, to be served consecutively. Alex Murdaugh would spend the rest of his life in prison for the murders of Maggie and Paul. For many observers, the verdict marked the end of one of the most shocking criminal cases in recent memory. A prominent attorney, a powerful family, a double homicide that had captured national attention, and a conviction that stunned people both inside and outside South Carolina. Yet even after the verdict, debate surrounding the case continued. Supporters of the prosecution pointed to the Kennel video, the digital evidence, and the timeline presented at trial. Others questioned whether the evidence truly eliminated every reasonable doubt. The arguments that had divided public opinion before the trial did not disappear after the verdict. If anything, they intensified. Because while the jury had reached its decision, the legal battle was far from over. Appeals would follow. New challenges would be raised. And years after the murders of Maggie and Paul, questions surrounding the case would continue to generate headlines. What many believed was the final chapter of the story was, in reality, only the beginning of another legal battle. One that would ensure the Murdaugh case remained in the spotlight long after the verdict had been delivered. In the years following Alex Murdaugh's conviction, the case continued to generate headlines across the United States. Appeals were filed. Arguments were challenged. And legal teams continued fighting over one of the most closely watched murder convictions in modern American history. Supporters of the conviction maintained that the evidence presented at trial painted a clear and compelling picture. They pointed to the Kennel video, the cell phone records, the timeline reconstruction, and the inconsistencies prosecutors highlighted throughout the investigation. Others remained unconvinced. Some questioned whether the largely circumstantial nature of the evidence was enough to eliminate every reasonable doubt. Others argued that the extraordinary publicity surrounding the case created concerns about whether Alex Murdaugh could truly receive a fair trial. The debates continued long after the jury delivered its verdict. But regardless of where people stand on the case, few would disagree on one thing. The murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh forever changed the course of South Carolina's most powerful legal dynasty. What began as a shocking double homicide quickly evolved into something much larger. A story involving power, influence, privilege, financial secrets, family tragedy, and a criminal investigation that captivated millions around the world. For investigators, the case became a painstaking effort to reconstruct a single night and determine what happened during the final moments of Maggie and Paul's lives. For prosecutors and defense attorneys, it became a courtroom battle fought over timelines, digital evidence, and competing interpretations of the facts. And for the public, it became a case that seemed almost impossible to believe. A respected attorney, a prominent family, a remote hunting property, and allegations that ultimately turned the entire story upside down. Even now, years after the murders, the Murdaugh case continues to be discussed, analyzed, and debated. New viewers discover it every day. True crime investigators continue examining the evidence. And questions surrounding the case remain the subject of ongoing discussion. Because some criminal cases fade from public memory. This wasn't one of them. The Murdaugh murders left a lasting mark not only on the people directly involved, but on the broader conversation about power, accountability, and justice in America. And perhaps that's why the story continues to resonate. Not simply because of how it began. And not simply because of how it ended, but because of everything that happened in between. If you found this case as fascinating as it is disturbing, be sure to subscribe to Dark Crime Casefiles and turn on notifications so you never miss a future investigation. Here, we uncover the stories behind the headlines, examine the evidence, and follow the facts wherever they lead. Because at Dark Crime Casefiles, no crime stays in the dark. Years after the murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh, the case remains one of the most shocking, complex, and controversial criminal investigations in modern American history.